Donald Trump just threw down another 50% tariff on Canada, and this time Canada isn't flinching. It's calling his bluff in public. Within days, premiers from coast to coast lined up behind their prime minister and basically told Washington, "Go ahead, try it." British Columbia's premier didn't even bother with diplomatic language. He said flat out, "There is not a chance in hell American alcohol is going back on Canadian shelves." This is what a country that stopped being afraid of its biggest trading partner actually sounds like, and it all happened in the span of about a week. Here's what we're covering in this one. We'll start with exactly what Trump just announced, the new 50% tariff, what it actually covers, and the deadline hanging over the whole relationship. Then we'll go straight to Mark Carney's own words from this week, what he told reporters about Canada's options, and why he's calling this a moment of opportunity rather than a moment of panic. After that, we'll get into the premiers because Doug Ford and David Eby said some of the most pointed things we've heard from Canadian leaders in this entire trade fight. We'll break down the actual economic exposure, what percentage of trade is really on the line here, and which provinces have the most to lose. And finally, we'll talk about why Canada, for the first time in this whole saga, actually looks like it's negotiating from a position of strength instead of weakness. Let's start with what actually happened. On Monday, Trump signed off on new 50% tariffs under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an old piece of trade law that lets a president hit back at countries he claims are discriminating against American goods. This particular round targets liquor, dairy products, cement, honey, hockey sticks, and some wood products while conveniently carving out exemptions for energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals, the exact sectors where Canada holds the most leverage. The tariffs are set to take effect on August 19th, unless a comprehensive deal gets signed before then. Desjardins economists estimate this specific package would affect roughly 28 billion Canadian dollars, or about 19.8 billion American dollars in annual exports, representing around 5% of everything Canada ships south. Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia carry the heaviest exposure, and analysts are already warning that the uncertainty alone, even before a single new tariff kicks in, is starting to chill business investment and confidence across those provinces. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Mark Carney's response this week wasn't the tone of a leader begging for mercy. Speaking after a meeting with Canada's premiers and territorial leaders in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Carney said Canada is intensifying negotiations toward a comprehensive deal, but made clear the country is fully prepared to respond if the tariffs actually land. If these tariffs or other measures come into force, there's a full range of things that we can do in that regard, he told reporters. Asked whether the August 19th deadline was Washington's genuine negotiating endgame or just another pressure tactic, Carney didn't dodge the question. He said bluntly, "It's both." He even suggested the entire tariff threat itself might just be a bargaining chip rather than a real policy, pointing out that normally there's a deadline and normally there's an outsized tariff associated with that deadline in these kinds of American trade negotiations, essentially calling out the pattern in front of the whole country. He declined to lay out exactly what retaliation would look like, calling that counterproductive, while talks are still ongoing, but added a line that says everything about where Canada's head is at right now. It's important to know what your options are. And it's not just Carney talking tough. The premiers backing him up said some of the sharpest things we've heard in this entire trade war. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said Canada needs to be on offense and keep everything on the table, including the idea of slapping a surcharge on electricity exports to the United States, a direct shot at American states that rely on Canadian power. British Columbia's David Eby went even further, ruling out any retreat on the provincial liquor boycott that's already cost American producers hundreds of millions of dollars. "There is not a chance in hell that U.S. alcohol is going back on the shelf in British Columbia," he said. Full stop. No hedging, no diplomatic softening. Prince Edward Island Premier Rob Lance summed up the mood in the room simply, calling for a united Team Canada approach across every province and territory, a level of coordinated political unity that frankly hasn't been this visible in Canadian politics in years. So let's talk about why this moment actually favors Canada more than it looks on the surface. This isn't 2025 anymore, when the first round of tariffs caught Canadian producers scrambling and unprepared. Canada has spent the last year systematically building alternatives, aluminum flowing to Europe at record prices, a trade surplus that just hit a 4-year high, non-US export share climbing to its highest level in over 4 decades, and now provincial governments that have already proven they can keep American products off shelves for over a year without blinking. Every one of those cards is sitting on the table heading into this deadline. When Carney says Canada has a full range of things it can do, he's not bluffing from a position of desperation. He's negotiating from a country that has quietly spent months insulating itself from exactly this kind of pressure. To be fair, this confidence carries real risk too. If the deadline passes without a deal, $28 billion in trade gets hit. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec absorb the sharpest impact, and businesses on both sides of the border are already reporting that the uncertainty itself is doing damage before a single new tariff is even collected. Nobody serious in Ottawa is pretending a trade war is free. But compare this to how Canada looked the first time Trump swung this hammer. Scrambling, uncertain, absorbing hits with no clear counter-strategy. This time, the tone from Charlottetown was completely different. Calm, coordinated, and unmistakably unafraid. So that's where things stand heading into August. Trump set a deadline expecting Canada to cave the way it might have a year and a half ago, and instead, he's getting a unified front of premiers openly discussing electricity surcharges and permanent boycotts, and a prime minister calmly telling reporters that everything is on the table. There's also a quieter signal buried in all of this that's easy to miss if you're only watching the headlines. Trump's own decision to carve out energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals from this latest round of tariffs is itself a tell. Those are precisely the sectors where the United States has the least room to absorb a Canadian counterpunch, whether that's electricity flowing into border states, potash feeding American farms, or critical minerals. American manufacturers can't easily source elsewhere. Leaving those categories untouched isn't generosity. It's an admission of where the real leverage sits. And Canadian premiers clearly noticed, which is exactly why Doug Ford is the one now floating an electricity surcharge rather than waiting to see what Washington does next. When the side setting the deadline is already tiptoeing around its own vulnerabilities, that tells you a lot about who's actually under more pressure as August 19th approaches. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, do you think Trump actually follows through on August 19th, or does another last-minute deal get cut before the deadline hits?